familiar routine disrupted. Frank Bennett, a seasoned park ranger, had dedicated over 3 decades of his life to the sprawling Ozark National Forest in Arkansas. The year was 2022, and at 65 years old, Frank found solace in the tranquil rhythms of nature, a stark contrast to the clamor of city life he had left behind. His days typically consisted of patrolling trails, assisting lost hikers, and observing the diverse wildlife that called the Ozark National Forest home. One ordinary morning in late June, Frank sat at the ranger station, enjoying his coffee and exchanging stories with his colleague, Mitch Hawkins. Mitch had recently returned from a rejuvenating vacation in the Rockies, and their conversation was filled with light-hearted banter about their experiences. However, the familiar hum of their routine was abruptly shattered when their radios crackled to life, bringing news that would plunge them into a chilling mystery. A group of hikers had stumbled upon an abandoned campsite deep within the forest, far from the designated trails. While discovering deserted campsites wasn't uncommon, the urgency in the hikers' voices and the remote location of the campsite sent a shiver down Frank's spine. He knew something was amiss. Without hesitation, Frank and Mitch gathered their gear and set off in their trusty Jeep, the engine's rumble a stark counterpoint to the mounting unease in their hearts. The familiar drive along the winding dirt roads did little to quell their apprehension. The dense canopy of oak and hickory trees formed a verdant tunnel above them, sunlight filtering through in dappled patches. They parked at the Cedar Creek trailhead and embarked on their hike, the forest floor soft beneath their boots. An unusual silence hung in the air. The usual symphony of birdsong and the rustling of leaves were replaced by an eerie stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. A scene of chaos and unease. After an hour of hiking, they reached the abandoned campsite. The sight that greeted them made Frank's stomach churn. It was as if a tornado had ripped through the area, leaving behind a scene of utter chaos. The tent lay collapsed and torn, its contents scattered across the forest floor like discarded toys. Food containers were strewn about, some half-eaten, others untouched. Personal belongings, clothes, books, even a camera lay abandoned in a wide radius around the central area, painting a picture of a hasty and panicked departure. Mitch, crouching down to examine a backpack, muttered in disbelief, "Jesus. Wallet's still here, Frank. Who leaves without their wallet?" Frank, scanning the area with growing unease, replied, "Someone in a big hurry, I'd say. Let's check the immediate surroundings. They might still be nearby." They split up, staying within shouting distance as they meticulously searched the area. Frank headed towards the edge of the clearing, where the trees grew denser and the shadows deepened, casting an unsettling gloom. A palpable sense of being watched prickled at his skin, though he tried to dismiss it as nerves. After 20 minutes of fruitless searching, Mitch's voice cut through the silence. "Frank, found something." Frank hurried over to where Mitch stood, holding up a hiking boot. It was caked in mud and looked as if it had been violently torn from someone's foot. "Christ," Frank breathed, taking in the sight. "Maybe they got injured." Mitch nodded grimly. "We should call for a search team. This doesn't look good." With heavy hearts, they radioed in their findings and retraced their steps back to the Jeep. The forest, which had always felt welcoming and familiar, now seemed to press in on them, its silence thick with unspoken menace. That night, a full search and rescue team combed the area, but their efforts proved futile. They found no tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing to explain the campers' hasty departure. The forest had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only a chilling void. The following days were a blur of paperwork and follow-up investigations. The missing campers were identified as the Johnsons, a family of 4 from Little Rock who had been eagerly anticipated back home by their relatives. Despite their best efforts, Frank and Mitch could find no trace of them beyond the abandoned campsite. The forest held its secrets close, refusing to yield any answers. The forest grows darker. A week after the unsettling discovery of the Johnsons' campsite, Frank and Mitch received another disturbing call. This time, it was from a terrified couple who had been camping near the same area. They reported strange noises at night, and even more alarmingly, found their campsite ransacked in the morning. The husband vividly described seeing a dark figure lurking at the tree line just before dawn, its eyes glinting with an unnatural light. A cold dread settled over Frank and Mitch as they geared up once again, This time, they carried their service firearms and extra supplies, a stark reminder that something sinister was afoot. The forest, as they hiked towards the couple's campsite, felt different. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to amplify their every footstep. They reached the site in the late afternoon, and the scene that greeted them mirrored the chaos of the Johnsons' campsite. Gear was strewn about, food containers were ripped open, and a palpable sense of panic lingered in the air. It was clear that the couple had fled in terror, leaving behind their belongings in their desperate bid to escape whatever had stalked them in the night. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Frank and Mitch decided to set up a temporary base and stay the night, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had spooked the couple. As darkness descended, the forest grew impossibly dark, the dense canopy of trees blocking out the moon and stars. The air grew heavy with humidity, and the silence was broken only by the occasional crackle of a twig underfoot. Frank and Mitch took turns keeping watch, their senses heightened, every rustle of leaves sending a jolt of adrenaline through them. The hours crawled by, and nothing happened. Just as Frank was beginning to think they might have been mistaken, a sound pierced the stillness, sending a shiver down his spine. It was a rustling in the underbrush, followed by a low, guttural sound that was unlike anything he had ever heard before. "Mitch," Frank whispered, shaking his colleague awake. "You hear that?" Mitch, instantly alert, grabbed his flashlight and gun. The rustling grew louder, coming from the direction of the densest part of the forest. They moved closer, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their hearts pounding in their chests. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with a gaunt frame and skin that looked almost translucent in the beam of their flashlights. Its eyes, large and luminescent, reflected the light with an unnatural silvery sheen, sending a wave of primal fear through Frank and Mitch. "What the hell is that?" Mitch muttered, raising his gun. Before Frank could respond, the creature lunged at them with inhuman speed, its movements fluid and predatory. Mitch fired, the gunshot echoing through the silent forest, but the creature barely seemed to notice the impact. It knocked Mitch to the ground, its long, bony fingers raking at his chest. Frank, reacting on pure instinct, raised his own gun and fired twice. The creature let out a high-pitched wail that sent chills down Frank's spine. It released Mitch and fled back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind an echo of terror in its wake. Mitch, shaken but mostly unharmed, save for some scratches and bruises, scrambled to his feet. They decided to abandon the campsite immediately, their initial bravery replaced by a cold, visceral fear. As they hiked back to the station, their guns remained at the ready, their eyes constantly scanning the forest for any sign of the creature's return. The once familiar forest now felt like a hunting ground, and they were the prey, a skeptical supervisor and mounting dread. Back at the station, they reported their encounter to their supervisor, Dave, but their story was met with skepticism. "You sure you didn't just see a bear?" Dave asked, his tone suggesting he didn't believe a word of their account. "It wasn't a bear, Dave," Mitch insisted, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "This was something else, something I've never seen before." Frank, too, tried to convey the sheer terror of their encounter, but words failed him. There was no way to adequately describe the creature's unnatural movements, its eerie silence, the sheer wrongness of its appearance. The following weeks were tense. Patrols in the area were increased, but the creature didn't reappear. Slowly, tentatively, the forest seemed to return to normal. The familiar sounds of wildlife gradually filled the air, but the memory of that night lingered, a dark cloud hanging over Frank and Mitch. The sense of unease remained, a constant reminder that something lurked in the shadows, something that defied explanation. Then, about a month after their terrifying encounter, another report came in, and this time it was even more chilling. A young couple, Kevin and Sarah Matthews, had vanished while hiking in the eastern part of the forest. Their car was found parked at the Sunset Trailhead, but there was no sign of them beyond that. A search party was immediately organized, and Frank and Mitch, haunted by their previous experience, joined the search, their hearts heavy with a sense of foreboding. They combed the forest for any clue, any sign of the missing couple, but the forest remained stubbornly silent. On the second day of the search, they found the Matthews campsite. It was abandoned, like the others, with signs of a hasty departure. Backpacks lay open, food scattered, a half-eaten sandwich abandoned on a rock. It was as if the forest had swallowed them up, leaving no trace, no whisper of their fate. Mitch, his face pale, looked at Frank, his eyes filled with a fear that mirrored Frank's own. "It's happening again, isn't it?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. Frank, unable to speak, simply nodded. He couldn't shake the feeling that the creature they had encountered was somehow responsible for the disappearances, that it was stalking the Ozark National Forest, claiming victims with terrifying ease. A confrontation in the darkness. Frank and Mitch continued their patrols, but the sense of dread grew heavier with each passing day. They were no longer just park rangers, tasked with protecting the forest and its visitors. They were men haunted by the unknown, by a creature that defied logic and reason, a creature that seemed to embody the darkest fears of the human heart. Then, one evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, ominous shadows through the trees, they received a call from the station. A local hunter, Jim Parsons, had reported seeing a strange creature near Black Fork Mountain, not far from where the Matthews had vanished. The description matched the creature they had encountered, and a grim determination settled over Frank and Mitch. They were going to put an end to this nightmare, once and for all. The drive to Black Fork Mountain was silent, both men lost in their thoughts, steeling themselves for the confrontation that lay ahead. They reached the area as darkness fell, the forest cloaked in deep shadows, the air thick with anticipation. Jim Parsons had marked the spot where he had seen the creature on his GPS, and Frank and Mitch moved cautiously towards it, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their senses on high alert. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs, but beneath it all, Frank could sense an underlying stillness, an unnatural hush that spoke of something watching, waiting. Suddenly, they heard it, that same low, guttural sound that had haunted Frank's dreams. They turned their lights towards the source of the noise, and there it was, standing at the edge of a small clearing, its eerie, glowing eyes fixed on them, burning with an unnatural light. "Spread out," Frank whispered to Mitch. "We need to corner it." They moved slowly, flanking the creature, trying to cut off its escape route. It stood unnaturally still, its long limbs almost blending into the shadows, as if it was waiting for them, inviting them closer. Then, with a burst of speed that seemed impossible for its gangly frame, it charged at Mitch. Mitch fired, the gunshot echoing through the trees, but the creature was too quick. It knocked him down, its claws slashing at his chest, drawing blood. Frank, adrenaline surging through his veins, raised his gun and fired 3 times in rapid succession, the shots deafening in the stillness of the night. He hit the creature square in the torso, and it let out a piercing scream, a sound that was both animalistic and otherworldly, a sound that ripped through the fabric of the night. The creature fell to the ground, its body twitching and convulsing, its movements gradually slowing until it lay still. Frank rushed to Mitch's side. He was bleeding from several deep gashes, but he was alive. They radioed for help, their voices shaking with relief and exhaustion, and waited, their guns trained on the creature's unmoving form. It didn't move, but Frank couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly dead, just waiting, biding its time. Help arrived within the hour, and Frank and Mitch were taken back to the station. Mitch was patched up and sent to the hospital for further treatment, while Frank gave his report, describing the creature in as much detail as he could, trying to convey the sheer terror of the encounter, the feeling of facing something that was fundamentally wrong, something that didn't belong in their world. The creature's body was taken away for examination, but Frank never heard what became of it. It was as if the whole incident was swept under the rug, filed away in some dusty cabinet, labeled unexplained, a testament to the human need to categorize and control the unknown, even when it defied all explanation. The forest remained silent. In the weeks that followed, the forest seemed to return to normal. The usual sounds of nature filled the air, and hikers and campers returned, oblivious to the terror that had stalked those woods. But Frank knew better. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, something that didn't belong, something that watched from the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity. Mitch, unable to shake the fear that had taken root that night, eventually left the job. Frank understood. He had seen the same terror in his friend's eyes, the same understanding that some things cannot be explained, cannot be rationalized away. but Frank couldn't bring himself to leave. The Ozark National Forest was his home, and he felt a responsibility to protect it, to protect the people who came to enjoy its beauty, unaware of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. Years have passed since that summer, and the memory of the creature has faded for most. But not for Frank. Every now and then, he catches a glimpse of something in the shadows, a flicker of movement that sends his heart racing. He knows it's still out there, waiting, watching, and he knows that one day it will return. The Ozark National Forest had changed him, made him wary, always on guard. But it was also his home, and he would do whatever it took to keep it safe, even if it meant facing that creature again. Because some things can't be explained, can't be understood. They just are, and all we can do is be ready when they come for us. As Frank sits in his cabin, the sun setting over the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, he can't help but wonder what else might be hiding in the depths of these ancient forests. What other secrets does this land hold? He may never know the full truth of what happened that summer, but he does know this. The world is stranger and more mysterious than we can imagine. And sometimes, the best we can do is stand our ground and face the unknown with courage and determination. Stanley Hayes and the Whispering Pines Enigma. A lifelong love for the outdoors. Stanley Hayes, at 72 years old, carried the weight of experience in his eyes. He had spent a lifetime immersed in the natural world, his love for the outdoors blossoming in the heart of a small Arkansas town called Millbrook. Growing up, he had felt a deep connection to the woods behind his modest childhood home, a sprawling expanse that seemed to whisper secrets on the wind. While other children spent their days glued to television screens and video games, Stanley could be found exploring the woods, building forts, and letting his imagination run wild as he pretended to be a fearless explorer, charting unknown territories. His father, Robert Hayes, an avid outdoorsman, instilled in him a deep respect for nature, teaching him valuable survival skills and the art of tracking. Some of Stanley's fondest memories were of early morning hikes with his father, watching the forest come alive around them, the air alive with birdsong and the scent of pine. As he grew older, Stanley's passion for the outdoors only intensified, shaping his aspirations. It seemed only natural to transform that passion into a career, and becoming a park ranger felt like the perfect fit. For Stanley, it wasn't about hunting or conquering nature, but about preserving its pristine beauty and sharing its wonders with others. After graduating high school, he enrolled in a forestry program at the state university, eager to learn everything he could about the intricate ecosystems that had captivated him since childhood. His dedication and hard work paid off, and he soon found himself living his dream, working as a park ranger, entrusted with the care and protection of the vast wilderness he had grown to love. Guardian of Whispering Pines. Decades passed, and Stanley rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a senior park ranger at Whispering Pines National Forest. This sprawling wilderness, covering over 1.2 million acres of diverse ecosystems, became his second home. Towering pine forests gave way to hidden waterfalls and deep, mysterious caves, each corner of Whispering Pines holding a unique allure, a hidden wonder waiting to be discovered. For nearly 30 years, Stanley dedicated his life to Whispering Pines, patrolling its trails, ensuring the safety of its visitors, and marveling at its ever-changing beauty. But the tranquil facade of the forest held a darkness, a secret that would forever alter Stanley's perception of the wild. The events that would shake him to his core began in mid-September, as summer reluctantly relinquished its grip, ushering in the crisp days of autumn. The weather was beginning to cool, the air carrying a refreshing chill that invigorated the senses. The leaves, once a vibrant green, were starting to turn, splashing the canopy with hints of gold and red, a breathtaking display of nature's artistry. It was Stanley's favorite time of year, a time when the forest seemed to hold its breath, caught between seasons, a time of transition and anticipation. A routine patrol takes an unsettling turn. On that particular day, Stanley was on a routine patrol, a familiar task that brought him comfort and a sense of purpose. He walked the northern trails, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth, a heady aroma that grounded him, reminding him of his place in the grand scheme of nature. He carried his usual gear, a radio clipped to his belt, a well-stocked first aid kit in his backpack, and his old trusty compass, a faithful companion on countless expeditions. Stanley had never felt the need to carry a firearm. In all his years as a ranger, the most dangerous encounters he had faced were with curious squirrels and the occasional raccoon with a penchant for pilfering unattended snacks. The forest, to him, had always felt like a sanctuary, a place of peace and tranquility. The day began like any other. Stanley checked a couple of campsites, ensuring that visitors followed park regulations and left no trace of their presence. He chatted with hikers, offering tips on the best trails and sharing his knowledge of the local flora and fauna. It was a day that affirmed his love for his job, for the opportunity to connect with nature and guide others in their exploration of its wonders. Around midday, Stanley decided to check an old, less traveled path in the northern part of the park. This trail had been temporarily closed due to fallen trees, but Stanley wanted to assess if the work crew had cleared the path, eager to reopen it to visitors. As he made his way down the overgrown path, he noticed something unusual, something that sent a prickle of unease down his spine. The usual symphony of forest sounds, birds chirping, leaves rustling, small animals scurrying about, was conspicuously absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting, listening. Stanley shrugged it off at first, attributing the silence to a natural lull, a brief pause in the forest's rhythmic heartbeat. But as he continued down the path, the silence grew oppressive, almost unnatural. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, a discovery shrouded in mystery. After an hour of walking, Stanley stumbled upon something that stopped him dead in his tracks. Nestled in a small clearing was an old cabin, its weathered wood a stark contrast to the vibrant greens and browns of the surrounding forest. Stanley had been working these woods for nearly 3 decades, and he knew every inch of this forest like the back of his hand. But this cabin, this dilapidated structure that seemed to have sprung from the earth itself, was not on any map he had ever seen. It was as if it had materialized from the shadows, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The cabin was clearly abandoned. Its wood was grey and rotting, its windows shattered and empty, its roof sagging precariously under the weight of time and neglect. Vines, like grasping fingers, had started to reclaim the structure, creeping up the walls and across the roof, weaving a tapestry of decay. The cabin exuded an eerie vibe, like something out of an old ghost story, a place where secrets lingered in the shadows. But more than fear, Stanley felt a surge of curiosity. In his experience, abandoned structures in the middle of nowhere often held fascinating stories, whispers of lives lived and forgotten. Sometimes, they even yielded valuable historical artifacts, pieces of the past that offered a glimpse into a different time. He approached the cabin cautiously, his boots crunching on the carpet of dead leaves that surrounded it. The porch creaked ominously under his weight, the sound echoing through the stillness of the clearing, as if warning him to turn back. But Stanley's curiosity outweighed his apprehension, and he pressed on, drawn towards the unknown. The front door hung precariously from its hinges, swaying slightly in a breeze that Stanley couldn't feel. He pushed it open, wincing at the loud groan of rusted metal, a sound that seemed to hang in the air, a mournful cry from a structure long forgotten. The interior of the cabin was a study in decay. A thick layer of dust covered everything, undisturbed for years, perhaps decades. Cobwebs stretched from corner to corner, like a macabre tapestry, catching the faint sunlight filtering through the broken windows. The air was stale and musty, carrying the unmistakable scent of abandonment and rot, a reminder of the relentless march of time. Despite its dilapidated state, Stanley could see that the cabin had once been someone's home. An old iron stove stood in one corner, its metal surface rusted and cold. A small table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, the wood warped and discolored. The remains of a bed frame leaned against the far wall, the mattress long gone, leaving behind only a skeletal frame. But what caught Stanley's eye, what drew him in like a moth to a flame, was an old leather-bound book sitting on the table. Its cover was worn, the leather cracked and faded, the title lost to time. Its pages were yellowed with age, their edges brittle and crumbling. A journal filled with strange tales. Curiosity piqued, Stanley made his way over to the table, his footsteps echoing in the empty room, the sound amplified by the silence. He picked up the book carefully, half expecting it to crumble to dust in his hands. But despite its age, it seemed remarkably well preserved, as if some unseen force protected it from the ravages of time. He opened the book gently, the old leather creaking softly, as if sighing in protest. Page after page of handwritten entries filled the book. The ink faded, but still legible, the words flowing across the pages like whispers from the past. It was a journal, a chronicle of someone's life, their thoughts, their fears, their secrets. As Stanley flipped through the pages, his eyes widened in surprise. The journal was filled with strange entries, accounts of local legends and sightings of a creature called the Ranid. The descriptions were vague and often contradictory, but it was clear that whoever wrote this believed wholeheartedly in its existence, in its power, in its connection to the forest itself. One entry, dated May 15, 1952, stood out, its words leaping from the page, etched in Stanley's mind. Saw it again today. The Ranid. It was down by Whispering Creek, just at dusk. Tall as a tree it was, with limbs like branches and skin pale as moonlight. It moved so fast, silent as a shadow. I tried to follow, but it vanished into the mist. I know folks think I'm crazy, but I know what I saw. The Ranid is real, and it's out there, watching us. The last entry in the journal mentioned something about a hidden cave deep in the forest, a place where the Ranid supposedly dwelled, a place of power and mystery. Stanley couldn't help but chuckle, thinking it was just the ramblings of some old hermit with too much time on his hands and an overactive imagination. Still, something about the journal intrigued him, a sense of unease settling over him. He decided to pocket the book, figuring it would make for an interesting read later, a tale to share with his colleagues back at the station, a way to pass the time on long, quiet evenings. A growing sense of dread. As Stanley stepped back outside, the silence of the forest hit him again, even more pronounced now, an almost tangible weight pressing down on him. The shadows seemed longer, darker somehow, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, observed by unseen eyes. He decided it was time to head back to the main trail, to return to the familiar, to the routine that grounded him. But as he turned to leave, he heard a rustling noise coming from the dense underbrush to his left. It wasn't the normal sound of a small animal moving through the leaves. This was different, bigger, heavier, more deliberate. "Hello," Stanley called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the silence, breaking the spell of the forest's quiet. "Anyone there?" There was no answer, just more rustling, louder this time, closer, as if something was approaching, circling him. Stanley's heart started to beat a little faster, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He moved closer to the sound, his hand instinctively reaching for the radio clipped to his belt, a lifeline to the outside world. As he approached, the noise stopped abruptly, and everything went still again. He stood there for a moment, scanning the area, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just trees and shadows, the familiar landscape of the forest he knew so well. He tried to dismiss his unease, telling himself it was just an animal, probably a deer startled by his presence. But as he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye, a flash of movement, a fleeting shadow, something tall and gaunt slipping between the trees, its movements fluid and silent, unnatural. Stanley froze, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. The rational part of his brain tried to explain it away, a trick of the light, a shadow playing on his overactive imagination, a bear standing on its hind legs. But deep down, in the primal part of his being, he knew he wasn't alone. Slowly, he backed away, keeping his eyes fixed on the spot where he had seen the movement. He reached for his radio, his fingers fumbling with the buttons, his mind screaming at him to call for backup, to get help. But all he got was static, the signal dead, the lifeline severed. Panic started to rise in his chest, a cold, constricting fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He picked up his pace, trying to stay calm, trying to convince himself that it was nothing, that his imagination was running wild. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, grew stronger with every step. He kept glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see the creature emerge from the trees, its eyes burning into him, its long limbs reaching out to grab him. But there was nothing there, just the trees and the lengthening shadows, the forest closing in on him, the silence deafening. A desperate flight. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows through the trees, Stanley reached the main trail. He was practically jogging now, his lungs burning, his legs aching, but he didn't dare stop. He could feel it getting closer, the unseen presence dogging his every step. And then he saw it again. Standing at the edge of the trail, partially obscured by the trees, its tall, gaunt form a silhouette against the dying light. It was taller than any man, easily over 7 feet, its long, spindly limbs reaching out like grasping claws. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, as if it were made of moonlight and shadows. And its eyes, oh its eyes, they were dark and hollow, staring right at him, burning into his soul. Stanley froze, his mind reeling, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was like something out of a nightmare, like the creature from the journal had stepped right off the page and into reality, its presence a violation of the natural order. He took a step back, and the creature moved, matching his pace, its movements fluid and silent, predatory. That was all it took. Stanley bolted, running faster than he had ever run in his life, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear it behind him, its footsteps unnaturally quiet for something so large, each footfall a hammer blow against his dwindling hope. His lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead, but he didn't dare slow down. He could feel it getting closer, gaining on him, its presence like a cold wind at his back. Up ahead, he saw the ranger station, a small wooden building where they kept supplies and a more powerful radio. It was his only hope, his only chance of survival. He pushed himself harder, his muscles screaming in protest, praying he would make it, praying the creature wouldn't catch him. He burst through the door of the ranger station, slamming it shut behind him, the sound echoing through the small building. He fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key in. He threw the bolt, securing the door, a flimsy barrier between him and the terror that stalked him. He grabbed the radio, his fingers trembling, his voice hoarse with fear. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Ranger Hayes. I need backup, I need..." But there was nothing. Just static, the airwaves dead, his connection to the outside world severed. He cursed, slamming the radio against the table in frustration, his mind racing. He was trapped, alone, with a creature of nightmare stalking him. He looked around frantically, searching for a weapon, anything to defend himself with. His eyes fell on an old hunting rifle mounted on the wall, a relic from the early days of the park, a forgotten guardian. He grabbed it, his hands trembling, checking to see if it was loaded. 2 rounds. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The scratching at the door started again, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. It was here, and it wanted in. The scratching turned into pounding, the door shaking on its hinges, the wood splintering under the force of the creature's assault. Stanley backed away, his heart pounding in his chest, aiming the rifle at the door. His hands trembled, his finger hovering over the trigger. The wood splintered again, and the door burst open, ripped from its hinges. The creature stepped inside, its tall, gaunt form filling the doorway, its hollow eyes fixed on Stanley, burning into him. Stanley fired, the sound deafening in the small room, the smell of gunpowder stinging his nostrils. The bullet hit the creature in the shoulder, but it barely flinched. It was like shooting a tree, the bullet seemingly having no effect on its unnatural flesh. He fired again, this time aiming for its head, for the dark, hollow eyes that seemed to suck the light from the room. The creature staggered back, letting out a high-pitched shriek that made Stanley's blood run cold. It wasn't dead, but it was hurt. Stanley didn't wait to see what it would do next. He bolted out the back door, running for his truck parked nearby, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest, the creature's shriek echoing in his ears. He jumped into the truck, fumbling with the keys, his hand shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he floored it, speeding down the dirt road, the trees blurring past him, the ranger station disappearing in the rearview mirror. He glanced back, expecting to see the creature chasing him, its long limbs carrying it over the ground with unnatural speed, its eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light. But there was nothing there, just the dark road behind him and the deepening shadows of the forest, the silence heavy with unspoken menace. Stanley didn't slow down until he was miles away, far from whispering pines, far from the creature that had haunted his dreams, far from the forest that had once been his sanctuary. He sat in his truck, his heart still pounding in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the scent of pine and damp earth still clinging to his clothes, a reminder of his encounter with the unknown. He had escaped, but he knew it wasn't over. The Ranid was out there, somewhere, in the depths of whispering pines, waiting, watching. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would never be truly free of the forest, that its secrets would forever haunt him, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks at the edge of our understanding, a darkness that whispers on the wind, a darkness that waits to claim us all, a tale left untold. Stanley returned to the ranger station, his mind still reeling from the encounter, his body bruised and aching. He reported what had happened, his voice shaky, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to convey the terror he had felt. But no one believed him. They looked at him with pity and concern, their eyes filled with a mixture of skepticism and disbelief. They said he must have imagined it, that it was probably just a bear, its appearance distorted by the darkness and the fog, by his own fear. Stanley knew better. He had seen the Ranid, and he knew it was real. It was something ancient and powerful, something that had been lurking in the shadows of whispering pines for centuries, perhaps millennia. It was a creature of legend, an embodiment of the forest's dark heart, a guardian of its secrets. The next few days were a blur. Stanley couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't shake the image of the Ranid from his mind. Its hollow eyes haunted his dreams, its long, spindly limbs reaching out to grab him, its guttural cries echoing in his ears. He quit his job a week later. He couldn't bear to be in the forest anymore, couldn't face the possibility of another encounter with the Ranid. He moved to the city, seeking solace in the anonymity of crowds, in the concrete and steel that seemed to offer.